This is the winter 2023 end of quarter video for Camp Path. We aim to help beginner CS learners overcome struggles with assignments through reflection. In order to understand the problem space, we also need to understand existing solutions. So office hours allow students to approach peer mentors and TAs with questions. However, this leads to a problem where they are told what to do. Some students misuse office hours and are given answers, and the consequence is that they perform well grade-wise, but they learn nothing. Another existing solution is Campus Wire or Piazza. These are digital tools where students can post questions anonymously, and these questions would be filtered by a professor so that they can validate the fact that they're not simply asking for answers, but they're actually asking for conceptual questions. And so this actually elicits a problem in which students suffer in silence. So some students believe that if they use a support tool, it would validate that they're bad in CS. And in an interview that I had, I was able to find that sometimes users also don't know how to use Campus Wire because they're unable to articulate their actual problem. So there's also a level of skill needed in order to use these tools. And the third problem is that even in the best case scenario, users are only able to address their presenting problem, which is that they're struggling with a CS assignment, but it goes no further than that. So they learn the CS concept, but their dysfunctional metacognitive beliefs about who they are, about their CS abilities still exist. And not only is the root cause not being addressed, but also using these learning tools actually feeds into their dysfunctional beliefs, as we can see in this example, in which a user received 100% on all of their assignments, but still felt like they didn't deserve the grade because they used a lot of help during the process. And so we can see in this diagram all three problems manifesting simply because existing solutions do not address the underlying dysfunctional beliefs and coping behaviors that students have, and simply only address, in the best case scenario, the presenting problem, but not actually, and in the worst case, just allowing students to continue to suffer in silence. So Path has a three-step approach for our conceptual approach. And the first one is bottom-up processing, which would allow users to undergo evidence-based reflection that would encourage them to think about the specific granular actions and unpack how these actions were actually ineffective. And this is important so that they don't simply feel like resort to the overarching belief that they struggle with CS and just use this blanket statement to understand themselves as an individual. And as for our top-down processing, the objective of this is to elicit an overarching identity. And so this would be the blanket statement about how they struggle in CS. But it is rooted in psychological hangups that would map onto dysfunctional metacognitive beliefs that they experience. And this is important so that users can, CS learners can understand where their root causes are actually hidden and make them visible through acknowledging them and also just consciously understanding them so that they can understand the impact of these beliefs on their behaviors. And our third and final part of our conceptual approach is to offer personalized solutions that are adapted to the problems that surface in both the bottom-up processing and in the top-down processing via coping strategies and personal resources. So for the bottom-up processing, we were able to understand how the importance of granular actions as opposed to blanket statements last quarter. And this quarter, we tested whether problems, obstacles, and instigators can map onto dysfunctional metacognitive beliefs. And we found actually that obstacles are not always obstacles that users elicit are not always related to dysfunctional metacognition. Sometimes it's related to external circumstances, but other times it actually is related to metacognition. So for instance, in this instance, in this user test, the user said that their ambition and coding skills did not match. So this would be an example of a successful reflection on dysfunctional metacognition. However, an earlier instance of their action said that showed that they said they had other things on their plate, and these are all valid responses to asking about whether they had problems, obstacles, or instigators. And in the worst case scenario, we also saw that users also claimed to not experience any obstacles. So the fact that there's so much variance in terms of the quality of the reflection and how correctly it maps onto our conceptual diagram, we decided that the prompt simply does not target dysfunctional metacognition. And so we aimed to address that, to make it more specific. And we believed that we needed a deeper reflection targeted towards why they were unable to achieve a goal. And in terms of forming a metacognitive goal is important so that they can have an understanding of an upward comparison they can make about where they are currently at and where they would actually like to be. So through the juxtaposition of goals and actions, users can identify metacognitive obstacles. So first we investigated whether users can identify metacognitive goals, and we found that they are when we offer them a list of metacognitive skills that they would like to have. And then we looked into whether users can use goals to recognize metacognitive dysfunction, and we were actually able to find that they could. So for instance, in this user test, we can see a user, we tested our original design argument about problems, obstacles, and instigators, and also our metacognitive goal design argument. And so we can see in this example just the contrast of the quality of the reflection. So the user was working on Dijkstra's algorithm, and their metacognitive goal was to use appropriate skills and strategies to solve the problem. And they reflected based on the juxtaposition of these two elements that they did a lot of guessing and checking, and are also really avoidant of CS homework. As opposed to the original design argument about problems, obstacles, and instigators, they just said that they had a time crunch, so this again is not metacognition related. We also tested alternative actions, so we believed that by iterating through alternative actions, users can formulate better alternative actions that are more effective than the action that they made on the assignment. So users would first consider the action and how it was ineffective to formulate an alternative action, and then they would consider obstacles that would come in the way of the alternative action, and then iterate on the alternative action again, and then they would think about psychological hangups, and then iterate on the alternative action again. So the ideal outcome is that the alternative action would improve every single time that they consider a new variable in the circumstances. However, what we found is that there's actually a strong circular logic that users tend to experience. So for instance, in this user test, the users said that they have coder's block sometimes where they just are afraid to start. And their solution to this obstacle is to just start. And this actually does not address the obstacle, it simply just puts them in greater conflict with the obstacle. And so it's not actually feasible. And what we found was that alternative actions are actually very hard to formulate even for the researchers. And even if we think about it for a really long time, it's just very difficult. We also tested alternative actions with different features, such as checkboxes to check for the quality of their alternative actions, which didn't work as well. And we also tested more for the iterations process, and it also didn't have much feasibility because the unalternative action does not address the original obstacle. And so we thought of a new argument, which came out of a metacognitive learning goals module that we tested before in the quarter. And we believe now that through the juxtaposition of personal resources with obstacles elicited, users can identify personalized methodologies for addressing their own metacognitive goals. And these obstacles would be the ones that are identified via metacognitive goals. And so we first tested whether users can identify personal resources, and we found that users are able to, in this user instance for instance. They were able to write down ChatGPT and also friends in class as some resources that they've used in helping them with CS assignments. And so a next step is to see what would happen if we juxtapose these obstacles with helpful resources. And so in this user test, I wonder what would happen if we put these two elements together and then ask a question. And so this would be our next iteration of our prototype, in which we juxtapose resources, obstacles, and metacognitive goal, and then ask how they would adapt the resource to overcome the obstacle and also achieve their metacognitive goal. And so this is an ideal outcome that the researchers have identified to be good. And so in terms of top-down processing, last quarter, we were able to help individuals elicit psychological hangups so that they can have a high-level understanding of their metacognitive beliefs. And we also believe that the same psychological hangup can manifest into different behaviors for different people. And so a response on how a user personally uses hangups can be used to generate personalized solutions, which would be important to increasing the likelihood of them adopting these solutions. And so when we tested this, we asked how we can reveal the way that dysfunctional coping beliefs and behaviors can manifest in idiosyncratic ways to different users. And so we found that questions asking how psychological hangups impact them in CS, and also questions about beliefs, can actually generate a personalization of the psychological hangup, as we can see in this user test. Our next step was to juxtapose between psychological hangups and ineffective actions, and this was important so that users can understand the direct linkage, which is shown in this black arrow here, how dysfunctional metacognitive beliefs actually cause behaviors in their day-to-day work. And this linkage is profoundly important in terms of creating a eureka moment. And in this user test where we juxtapose actions and hangups, we are actually able to link to help a user understand what was going on in the assignment in relation to the psychological hangup. They were anxious about the assignment and they got frustrated, whereas they otherwise would not have been if they did not experience a low sense of belonging and low self-efficacy. So our next steps would be to address the variability in the responses that we're receiving. So sometimes these two questions are related to dysfunctional metacognition, but other times they're related to external circumstances. One thing that one unexpected finding that we found during the top-down processing testing is on coping mechanisms, which we expected to be about could be mapped to dysfunctional coping behaviors. However, they actually turned out to be quite self-compassionate. So for instance, in this user test, they experienced imposter syndrome and reflected that they could do breathing techniques and affirmations. However, they simply just were not doing that during the assignment. And this is another instance where a user experiences low sense of belonging and low self-efficacy, and their solution to that is to work out, to go to therapy, to journal, to talk with friends. And this is, again, a really effective way of offering themselves relief from a stressful circumstance. And simultaneously, while this observation of coping mechanisms was going on, we also observed the failure of external resources. We believe that it's necessary to offer users with external resources because we see the limitations of personal abilities, personal skills, and so it's important to receive external help besides being self-sufficient as learners. And so we felt that external resources were important. However, in our design for a system of solutions that map onto psychological hangups that can automatically generate resource suggestions, we found that the system actually does not provide appealing resources for users to try out. So for example, if a student checks imposter syndrome, they would be automatically recommended to student organizations and CAPs. So when we tested this in this user instance where they actually did say that they experienced imposter syndrome, they said in an interview that if they're struggling with an assignment, they're not sure if going to a student org is the solution, and that is very valid. There's no direct causational relationship between solving an assignment and going to a student org, and it also seems like they were seeking more short-term relief as opposed to long-term solvency. And even though during the prototype they said that they might use the external resources, the user actually said during the post-reflection survey that the solution offered do not seem inviting, and so it does not meet their objectives. So we also tried a different iteration of external resources. We asked, what if we just simply do something simpler? So we simply provide one and recommend one solution that can definitely assist all students, which is the professor themselves. And we even created a template for emailing the professor about something that they feel is difficult to overcome. And in this user test, we saw that the user feels like it's difficult to remember all the theories in CS214 and applying it to real-world problems, but they did not want to share this with the professor because they're not interested in sharing their personal insecurities with professors. So we thought of a new argument, which is that coping mechanisms might be a better solution than external resources. It's the psychological hangups or private affairs, and perhaps being open and talking about them with a person of authority in CS will only exacerbate the psychological hangups. So by juxtaposing coping mechanisms with actions taken during assignments, perhaps it could elicit a way to adapt the coping mechanisms to assignments so that they can actually use them in their day-to-day life. And so this would be an effective next step. In fact, this is the next iteration of our reflection tool that I would like to test out. We also found that some users actually claim to have no hangups, so this could be an edge case for our tool. But in this instance, the user did not check any psychological hangups and claim that they do not experience any CS hangups. They also always keep a positive mindset. So the user either does not realize they are experiencing hangups, or they are experiencing root causes outside of the scope of the hangups listed. However, there is still evidence of psychological hangups in the user test that they did. For instance, they debugged hundreds of lines of code and claimed it was really frustrating. So they probably did not have a positive mindset during this frustrating moment. And they also said that they could have used a debugger that is part of DSSL2, but they did not. And so there's really no investigation into why they did not use the DSSL2 debugger. So there's just more to be explored here. So some takeaways are that, so for the bottom-up approach side, we found that problems, obstacles, and indicators are too generic, and we actually need something as goals to make an upward comparison for users to really understand what they would like to achieve and to really point out their metacognitive lackings that are actually more appropriately mapped onto dysfunctional metacognitive beliefs. And we also found that alternative actions actually are very, very difficult to generate, and so because they simply cannot be generated without more context about what problem they're trying to solve. And so the reflection process actually broke down during the generic problems, obstacles, and instigators phase. But even if the users do have a good understanding of the problem, alternative actions are still too difficult to generate so that they're effective and feasible. So next quarter, we would like to adapt personal resources as solutions instead of having them think about alternative actions. In terms of top-down processing, we initially believed that coping mechanisms could map onto dysfunctional coping behaviors, but we actually found that coping mechanisms are actually effective and self-compassionate coping strategies. And so we would like to find ways to adapt them to offer solutions, especially since we discovered that external resources are just not an appropriate solution to resolve psychological hangups, and users are just unlikely to use them. So these would be some next steps to explore. And we also have some unanswered thoughts about negative emotionality, which appeared in our diagram about existing solutions. And our tool currently does not have an explicit functionality that addresses negative emotionality, but I wonder if the tool itself actually resolves the issue because of the empathetic wording of problems and questions, and just offering the user a space to process their challenges without the fear of judgment, because it is just a private tool that nobody has to see. And perhaps a reflection tool implicitly suggests that psychological hangups are valid and commonly experienced, which therefore improves negative emotionality. But if this isn't true, and even if this were true, it's simply implicit right now, what are some ways we can actually directly address negative emotionality through functionality? So these are some food for thought for the future.